If you're with me in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32 is our text this afternoon. Verse 32, we've been working our way through the book of Hebrews for a number of months now, and perhaps even through the chapter 11 for a number of months. Verse 32, and what shall I more say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon, and of Barak, and of Samson, and of Jephthah, of David also, and Samuel, and of the prophets. I was going to ask, do you know any long-winded preachers? But I'm afraid of what your answer might be. Long-winded preachers should take note of verse 32. When you are running out of time, summarize and get to the point quickly. That's what Paul's saying here. What more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon, and of Barak, and of Samson, and Jephthah, of David also, and Samuel, and of the prophets. Paul was undoubtedly an experienced preacher, and he says, I don't have all the time that I want to tell you about all the things I want to tell you about. I could go on, but I've run out of time. I've run out of time. I remember the first time I was ever asked to preach. It was at a youth meeting, and I was told, just if you come along and share something with us, no more than 15 minutes. 15 minutes. Well, I'd been warned well in advance. In fact, it was a couple of months prior that I'd been asked, and I'd given the time and the date, and I studied, and I prepared, and I read, and I wrote out my manuscript in anticipation of that meeting. And eventually the time came, and the meeting was taking place, and that all the preliminaries, the singing and the music and the prayers and such things, and then I was asked to come forward and to bring a message from the Lord. And I went forward extremely nervously, but I felt well prepared in myself. I've read over my sermon so many times I could actually recite it from memory. That's how well I had learned it. And I took off my watch and I set it on the desk in front of me, and I began to preach. And I preached my message. And I looked down at my watch, and instead of it being 15 minutes, I preached for 7 minutes. 7 minutes. So what was I going to do with the remaining 8 minutes, the remaining time? Well, I said, just to recap. And I preached the whole message again, word for word. They heard it twice, word for word. After that initial experience, I determined not to get caught short ever again. And so, if anything, I tend to over-prepare now for my sermons. And generally I have enough material on hand to preach 2 or 3 times. But here in this passage, when I read verse 32, it feels to me like the preacher is looking at the clock. It's 10:55. He's got to be finished by 11. The congregation have one final hymn to sing, and he's still got his final point to preach. And he knows that sinking feeling. He hasn't quite reached the climax of his message. There's a couple of options open to him. He can carry on to 11:20. That just frustrates everyone. Or he can keep that final point and try and expand upon it next week and turn it into a 2-part message. Or he can do what Paul has done, and he can summarize his final point and get to the final point in the last couple of minutes. Paul's looking at the clock on the wall and saying, I've got plenty of more things that I would like to say, but time would fail me to tell you everything I want to tell you about Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah and David and Samuel and the prophets. So what Paul didn't do, I'm going to do. I'm going to preach about Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah. 4 names that he mentions here, along with David and Samuel and many of the prophets. That includes everyone from Elijah to Malachi. David and Samuel, we can certainly understand why they are listed in the gallery of faith. They stand head and shoulders above all of their contemporaries as men who walk by faith. David has the wonderful privilege of being described as a man after God's own heart. We know why he's here, but what of these others? Why were these men highlighted? 4 men from a period of time known as the time of the Judges, a wild time of Israel's history when everyone did that which was right in their own eyes. And he mentions 4 in particular: Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah. What do we know about these men? Well, we know that Gideon did battle against the Midianites. Barak defeated the Canaanites. Samson fought against the Philistines, and Jephthah against the Ammonites. This is the only time that these men are mentioned in the New Testament. And that very fact alone should make us stop for a moment and pay attention that these men are regarded as heroes of the faith and find their way into this great gallery of faithful followers. But they also have another thing that tie them together. They had rather significant character flaws. Someone said they're not alabaster saints, and you think of the alabaster saints, the white marble saints. They're not pure by any stretch of the imagination. They're flesh and blood heroes, men whom God has honoured in spite of their flaws. And so in that respect, they're very much like ourselves. Their faith is like our own faith. It's sometimes mingled with fear, or stained with unbelief and doubt, or spotted with compromise, or troubled with human reason. And yet, their faith being imperfect, and they themselves being badly flawed, that their faith nonetheless is noted by God and honoured by Him. So if we take away even just one word from this message this afternoon, think of the little word anyway. Anyway. God honoured their faith anyway. Let's look at these 4 men. Time would fail me to tell of Gideon. You read of Gideon in Judges chapter 6. The angel of the Lord appeared to him one day and announced, "The Lord is with thee, thou mighty man of valour." This surprising message came in the midst of the Midianite oppression of Israel. The Midianites were a vast army from the east who invaded the land of Israel, riding upon their camels, bringing their flocks and their herds, and they came every year. And they came at harvest time. Just as the people of Israel were harvesting their crops, the Midianites would arrive, they would plunder the land, they would ride their camels throughout the area, and then once they had taken everything that they wanted and needed, then they would ride on to the next place. You wouldn't see them from one year to the next, but come harvest time, you could be sure the Midianites will be back to do it all over again. We find Gideon there in Judges 6 at a time of harvest, fearful that they're going to lose this year's harvest also, everything that they've laboured and worked for all year. The Midianites are invading once again. The people are reduced to living in caves because they're frightened of the terrible army that comes. In response, God comes to Gideon, taps him on the shoulder and says, "I'm going to use you to deliver my people, thou mighty man of valour. You're the man who I have chosen to deliver my people from the hand of the Midianites." And he repeats it on a number of occasions. And to each and every time, Gideon responds almost, "Me? You want me to deliver the people? You've got the wrong man. A mighty man of valour? You don't know me at all. I'm the weakest, feeblest part of our family, and my family's not great either. You've got the wrong person." But the scene has been set. There's going to be a showdown between the men of Israel and the invading Midianites. The armies are gathering. The enemy is approaching. The battle is about to get underway, and Gideon, you're my man. Gideon's still not sure. Not convinced that the Lord has picked the right choice at all. And he asks God to give him an unmistakable proof that he really is the one that he wants to lead Israel. And he even named the sign. I'll put out a fleece and I'll ask God to make the fleece wet and the ground dry. And when God did that, even that didn't convince him. He said, I want you to do it again, but only in reverse. Make the ground wet and the fleece dry. And only then did Gideon finally believe that the Lord had selected him to be his champion, his leader of the men of Israel, to go out and do battle. Now, it wasn't a sin for him to ask for a fleece, but it was certainly a sign of his weak faith, because he already knew what God wanted him to do. God already spoken to him about the matter, but his faith was weak. And all through the life of Gideon, every time you see him, we are reminded that this mighty man of faith is actually really a man of weak faith through whom God did great things. There's a big difference. You get to Judges chapter 7. Gideon has assembled his army. He's 32,000 men. God says, that's too many. I want you to send some of them home. Anyone that's fearful, go home. 22,000 men went home. 10,000 left. God says, still too many, Gideon. Have you seen the Midianites? Have you seen how many they are? They're like grasshoppers for number. They come in and they take over, and there's more than could possibly be counted. Still too many. Bring them down to the water. Have them drink. Divide them as to the way they drink. Those that lap like a dog and those who hold the water to their faces, separate them out. 300 men are left. God says that will do. 300 men against a multitude. God has Gideon go to work with the soldiers. Splits them into 3 groups. He's going to have a nighttime attack, a surprise attack upon the unsuspecting Midianites. He's going to use a classic military ruse in order to make them think that his army is greater than it actually was. If they do something unusual, he divides his men. They surround the camp of the Midianites, and at the appointed hour they begin to shout and to blow trumpets, and they crack their vessels, and they display their torches in the dark, and the Midianites, in total confusion, begin to flee, and a complete rout of the enemy is had, and a victory by Gideon and his men. Turns out that Gideon was quite a fine military leader once he got past his initial fear. As long as he thought that he couldn't do it, well, he was right in that regards. But once faith replaced his fear, he won a mighty victory for the Lord. Gideon was fearful. What about Barak? Time would fail me to tell of Barak. What do you know of Barak? I suspect that every time you hear the name Barak, you probably add another name alongside it. Deborah. Deborah and Barak. Who was Deborah? Well, she wasn't his wife. Deborah was the only female judge of Israel. The spiritual life of Israel had fallen so low that there were no godly men. There was no one there to take responsibility and to lead the people of God in the things of God. And God used Deborah. Now, that's not to knock Deborah in any sense. She's clearly brave and decisive and bold. And she judged Israel because there was none other that God could call upon to step up and do that job. And after 20 years of oppression under the hands of the Canaanites, God raised up this prophetess, Deborah, to represent him before the people. And she has a message for Barak. Barak was the commander of the armies of Israel, and Deborah sent him a message and told him, go into battle. And she even gave him the battle plan. I'm going to read to you from Judges chapter 4, the verses 6 and 7. And she, that's Deborah, sent and called Barak the son of Abinoam out of Kadesh Naphtali, and said unto him, Hath not the Lord God of Israel commanded, saying, Go and draw toward Mount Tabor, and take with thee 10,000 men of the children of Naphtali, and of the children of Zebulun, and I will draw unto thee to the river Kishon Sisera, the captain of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his multitude, and I will deliver him into thine hand. On one hand, it's really quite simple. Here's the battle plan. Go and meet him at Mount Tabor. God will give him into your hand. All he has to do is rally the troops, go into battle, win the victory. God has promised it. What is Barak's response? Verse 8 Judges chapter 4. Barak said unto her, If you will go with me, then I will go. But if thou wilt not go with me, then I will not go. Gideon was fearful, Barak was timid. If you will go with me, then I will go. It's just pathetic, really. It's probably not politically correct to say this, but it's a man's job to saddle up and to face the enemy, to defend his home and his family. It means showing courage in the face of danger. And Barak won't go into battle unless Deborah goes with him. You think I'm being hard on him? Listen to what Deborah says. Verse 9. She said, I will surely go with thee, notwithstanding the journey that thou takest shall not be for thine honour. For the Lord shall sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. And Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh. Even Deborah, who was a great leader in her own right, didn't think much of Barak's response. It was timid. It was mealy-mouthed. It was poor on his part. Now we can partly understand his hesitation, because we're told a little bit later that the Canaanites had something that the Israelites completely lacked. They had iron chariots. They had the latest of military technology. That meant that their enemy had a huge advantage over them upon the battlefield. For the children of Israel to attack the Canaanites and their iron chariots seemed like a suicide mission. It's like sending the Boy Scouts against a tank brigade. But God had a plan. He would send a storm, and he would flood the river Kishon. And in the mud, the iron chariots began to sink and get stuck, and has turned into a slaughter, a total victory for the men of Israel. In a quite ironic twist, Sisera, the captain of the Canaanite army, escaped from the battlefield, hid himself in a tent, and while he slept, a woman by the name of Jael drove a tent peg through his head. Eventually Barak would come on the scene, and she said to him, Come, and I will show thee the man whom thou seekest. There he was, Sisera, nailed to the ground, tent peg through his temple, killed not by Barak or one of his men, but by a woman. So while Barak did indeed lead the troops into battle, it's Deborah and Jael who get the credit. Was he a bad guy? Not at all. He was just a good guy, just too dependent upon others. We give him credit where it's deserved, because he's listed as a man of faith, and he was, but he was timid when he should have been strong. Gideon was fearful when he should have been a follower of what God said. Barak was timid when he should have been strong. What shall we say then of Samson? You probably know the general outline of Samson's story, how he could defeat the Philistines and then fall foul to Delilah, revealing the true source of his strength. We know how he would be bound and captured and put into prison, how eventually his eyes would be poked out. He had eventually gained his revenge by killing 3,000 Philistines in one of the most dramatic death scenes in all of the Bible, bringing down the temple with his great strength. But there's so much more to Samson. Someone said he had it all: good looks, great strength, popularity, the blessing of God, and he threw it all away. Of his life, it could be truly said that he had tremendous potential. No man in the Bible started out with as much going for him as what Samson had. And no man ended with less than what Samson had. He had it all, and he let it get away from him. And ultimately, Samson is just a bundle of contradictions. He's a man of faith with a weakness for women. A man of prayer, but given to uncontrollable rage. He was a leader of Israel who lusted after the Philistines. He's a man of God, but he lacked common sense. Empowered by the Spirit, but so often lived in the flesh. It could be said of Samson that he was a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. And yet we find him mentioned here in Hebrews 11 as a man of faith. A man of faith. Filled with problems, but a man of faith. His chief problem, of course, was his inability to control himself. We find him filled with lust, then filled with anger, then filled with lust again, then filled with anger. He's an emotional roller coaster from the peak to the valley, then round the sharp corner and back all over again. One moment he's worshipping God, the next moment he's flirting with Philistine women. One moment he's leading an army to a stunning military victory by the power of God's Spirit, and the next he's shacked up in a Philistine town. Not long after he meets Delilah, who tricks him, revealing this source of his power, leading to imprisonment and death. He never learned to control himself. He lacked self-control. The words of Proverbs 16, verse 32 could have been written about Samson. He that is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he that ruleth his spirit than he that taketh a city. Now in his day, Samson had taken more than one city, but he never learned to control his temper, never learned to rule his spirit. He lacked even the slightest ability of self-control. And in the end, his emotions ran away with him. At best, Samson's life is a zigzag that teaches us that it's possible for us to be empowered by the Spirit of God and do great things for the Lord, and yet if our life is not fully yielded to Him, that we can end up in great disaster also. And that's really the quandary of Samson's life, whereas times the Spirit of the Lord came upon him and he did wonderful things for God, but there never seems to have been a point in his life where he was fully under God's control. He's deeply flawed, just like the rest of us. And he's continually battling against the flesh and the world and the devil. He could do amazing things for God, just like we can. And then turn around and do something just so incredibly stupid that you think, how could he possibly have done that? And yet here we find him in Hebrews chapter 11. What more shall I say? The time would fail me to tell of Gideon and of Barak and of Samson and of Jephthah. Jephthah. We read of Jephthah in Judges chapter 11. Our introduction to him is quite startling. Jephthah the Gileadite was a mighty man of valor, and he was the son of a harlot. Not a very promising beginning. Maybe that's partly why he became such a great warrior, trying to overcome aspects of his past, things that tend to drive him to prove himself over and over again. But as he grew to manhood, his family turned against him. He ran away from them, and he actually gathered unto himself basically a group of thugs. He was a leader of a gang. And this man, from this bad background, becomes an Old Testament gang leader. And then the Ammonites attack the men of Israel, and they come running to Jephthah and ask, "Come back home. Bring your gang with you, lead them in battle, and help us defeat the Ammonites. You can be our captain." And after some negotiation, he accepted the offer. He thought he would try to parley with the Ammonites to begin with. It didn't work. And then we're told that the Spirit of the Lord came upon him as he went to prepare for battle against the Ammonites. And in that moment, he made a foolish mistake, one that would haunt him for the rest of his days, one that we're reminded of every time we hear his name. He made a vow. And he made a vow that if the Lord would help him to win the battle, that he would offer to the Lord as a burnt offering the first thing that came through the doors of his house when he returned home from fighting. Now, he maybe expected the first thing to come through the doors of his house to be an animal of some sort. So we can only imagine his shock and his dismay when it turned out to be his daughter, his only child, coming out to welcome him home. And distraught, he ripped and rent his clothes, and he said, "For I have opened my mouth unto the Lord, and I cannot go back. I made an oath to God, and I can't break my promise." And so we're told that for 2 months, his virgin daughter spent time in the hills with her friends. And we're told that at the end of that time, she returned unto her father, who did with her according to his vow which he had vowed, and she knew no man. Now, this is hotly debated. What did Jephthah actually do with his daughter? Some believe he actually offered her as a burnt offering to the Lord, a heathen practice that was strictly forbidden by God. Others believe that he offered his daughter in a life of perpetual virginity, that she would never marry, never have a family. Either way, whatever position you fall to, it was a rash and a foolish vow, and it came on the heels of a great victory. The vow was unnecessary. It was dangerous. These were depraved times in the land. The moral situation had sunk so low that some believed that Jephthah actually sacrificed his daughter, as he said. We've got the hardest case before us here. A gang leader for God, son of a prostitute, who made a rash vow, wins a mighty victory, and apparently sacrifices his own daughter. And the next time you read of him is in Hebrews chapter 11 as a man of faith. One of the commentaries that I was reading in preparation for this called them 4 cracked pots. What are we to make of these men? Gideon, who's afraid to answer God's call. Barak, who's so timid that he needs someone to hold his hand. Samson, who can't control himself. Jephthah, who made a foolish vow and perhaps even carried it through. These are seriously flawed men, and yet they made Hebrews chapter 11. The thing is, if there's room for them, then there's room for you and me. Because God is saying, deep down, these were men of faith who believed in me, who were willing to act upon what they believed. Now, their significant faults cannot be overlooked, but their faults cannot and do not keep them out of this hall of fame. And so when we ask the question, why would God use men like these? Well, because these are the people, these flawed people, that demonstrate the grace of God, so that when the victory is won, that there is no doubt in anyone's mind that it's God alone who deserves the praise. That's what Paul said, 2 Corinthians 4 verse 7. We have this treasure in earthen vessels, that the excellency of the power may be of God and not of us. That's all we are, clay pots, ordinary earthenware, easily cracked and oftentimes broken. We're not expensive china that you would find in some fancy store. We're just ordinary Kmart kitchenware, useful but not expensive, cracked and chipped in various places, but God in His grace still uses us. It's a very humbling thought. God uses us anyway. Gideon was fearful, but God used him anyway. Barak was timid, but God used him anyway. Samson was foolish and did lots of foolish things, but God used him anyway. Jephthah made a terrible mistake, but God used him anyway. And when I think about it, deep down, it really comes down to this. Either we believe in the redeeming grace of God, or we don't. And if we do, then we're not at all surprised that God includes these 4 flawed heroes in the Hall of Fame. And we're glad that they made the cut, because it means that if God can use men like these, He can use people like us. Because we too are flawed, chipped and cracked and oftentimes broken. Here's what John Calvin said in his commentary on this verse. Thus in all the saints something reprehensible is ever to be found. Yet faith, though halting and imperfect, is still approved by God. There is therefore no reason why the faults that we labour under should break us down or dishearten us, provided we go by faith to go on in the race of our calling. So the next time you look in the mirror and you see beyond the outward appearance to what's really underneath, and you recognise that you're far from perfect, well then by faith keep on going. That faith, though halting and imperfect, still approved by God. I trust that we will seek to overcome the faults that we see, seek to be truly made anew in Christ Jesus, with the old things passing away and all things becoming new, but to recognise that while we are far from perfect here upon this earth, that the Lord can use us anyway. Question is, are we available to Him for use? Are we accessible to Him? It's been well said that the ability that God desires most from us is our availability. Are we available to Him? And I trust that the Lord will use us, weak and feeble and frail as we are, for His glory, so that all of the praise might be His. And the Lord bless these few thoughts to our hearts this afternoon. Amen.